This week on the agenda, China Shock 2.0. How's the rest of the world reacting to the continuing rise of the globe's second largest economy? In 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization, a wave of Chinese goods swept into Western markets. Low-cost labor and more efficient production systems also drew factory investment to China and away from wealthier nations. Economists at the time called this the China Shock, and much was based on exports and what's now referred to in China as the old three: clothing, furniture and appliances. Over time, that then developed into what's called the new three: electric vehicles, batteries and solar panels, a more advanced basis for Chinese exports to the West. And now, with the announcement of a focus on a new three: artificial intelligence, robotics and innovative drugs, economists are looking well beyond low-cost manufacturing as China's lead in new technologies points to a China Shock 2.0. Joining me now are Pascal Coppens, author of China's Next Miracle, political commentator and journalist Martin Jacques, and Dr. Michal Meidan is head of China Energy Research at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Pascal, let me start with you. What do you make of the way the world has reacted so far to this China Shock 2.0?
Well, thanks for having me, but I do believe this reaction is definitely an overreaction. I think this is due to the fact that it looks for many people in Europe, in the US, as a real wake-up call. A wake-up call that Chinese quality of goods is actually as good or even better than some Western products. And that's something that over the past, we never realized that that would be possible. And so the reality, in my view, is that we are fighting against some loss of competitiveness that we have inside Europe, inside of the US, but we're trying to fix that by doing more protection and looking at de-risking from China, putting some tariffs, restrictions. So it's very much about protecting what we have, and I often feel like we're protecting the past, and because of that are not protecting our future. And somehow this China Shock 2.0, as we call it, is new to us. But we had a China Shock 1.0, which we knew. Just in America, there was a lot of job losses. In Europe, it was a lot less, meaning that there was a lot of wealth and purchasing power created by having these cheap products as well. So the China Shock 1.0 wasn't that big, which means that the China Shock 2.0 is even bigger. And we're reacting as well, much bigger as a result.
Martin, what do you think? I mean, why do you think that there seems to be so much resistance in the West to embracing Chinese innovation rather than seeing it as the opportunity it is?
Well, I think that the atmosphere in Europe, certainly, I think is a bit different from how it was in the period, 2018, 2020, and so on, when the sort of anti-China attitude was quite virulent. And I don't think it's quite the same this time round. I think it's much more coming from, the European Union bureaucracy and sections of the US government, if not all of it. But I think the attitude amongst people is a bit different now. Then China was really quite unknown factor, certainly in Europe. And it was waking up to the fact that China was a rising force, but not that it knew much about it. Now, this time around, I think people are a little bit wiser on the whole. I don't want to speak for everyone, but I think there is that element of knowing more about China, and in particular, experiencing more about China. The most singular example of this for me is the spread of Chinese electric vehicles, which, in my own country, there's been a really big change over the last couple of years. People are, quite receptive and objective. And the idea that they're a threat to our way of being, doesn't really feature. Certainly not in the UK, which barely makes cars these days. Of course, we're not talking about Germany or even France in this context. So I think that I'm a little bit more optimistic. I think that this argument is not going to hack it in the same way that it might have done 5 to 10 years ago, and I think that the Chinese are quite right, by the way, to not call it China Shock 2.0, but China Opportunity 2.0, because that's exactly what it is. I mean, China's defining the future, and we need to be part of it.
And there does seem to be a bit of a shift when it comes to business, doesn't it, Michal? Because I'm thinking of the bosses of two of Europe's biggest energy companies, Total Energy and Électricité de France, who've just come back from China, saying they've got lessons to learn from China. Do you think it is a turning point in the conversation about China, from seeing it as a competitor to seeing it as a source of expertise?
I mean, I think the conversation is constantly changing. Where the shift is perhaps the biggest is from a perception that China is the market you sell into and you introduce European ideas, expertise, innovation into. And now, as you've just said, it is a source of expertise, of new technologies, but also of system design, of these sort of integrated networks and platforms that are coming. So it's the clean tech, but it's also how various sources of clean tech work together. So I think competition was always part of the conversation. I think now it's much more visible in a host of sectors where Chinese firms are leading, but also, as Pascal was saying earlier, where Europe has lost some of its competitiveness. But the debate is quite fragmented from certain governments that see the threat and the shock to industry. And I think we have to recognize that Europe losing its industrial competitiveness, and that's both a factor of China doing really well and Europe not doing so well, it's still a political problem. So wishing it away is not going to help us. At the same time, businesses are acknowledging the benefits and as you said, China as a source of expertise, China as a source of very deeply competitive supply chains as well.
I mean, Pascal, Michal was talking about that gap there that we're seeing between China and the rest of the world. And that's something that EDF's Bernard Fontana pointed out, describing a support structure built in China in 1 week that could take 2 years in France. And what do you think explains a gap like that? Is it engineering? Is it regulation, political decision-making, or something else?
Well, I think the typical explanation is that it's all of these above, which typically is looking at it from a top-down. Regulation, even engineering, planning, as well as political decision-taking, it's all top-down decision. But I've lived and worked in China for 20 years and together with innovators in different industries. And you can feel that most of what's happening now is actually bottom up. And the combination with a strong top down and a bottom up is actually what makes the difference. And so it's a lot more about the innovation power and the collaboration power that we're not noticing yet enough. And we think it's still a top down thing. I mean, I was at EDF China in Beijing. EDF in China. I was in Beijing just 3 months ago, and I talked to them, and they gave me the exact same story, and it was really like, yeah, China can build a nuclear plant in 3 to 5 times the speed than France, which is quite interesting, knowing that the technology and the know-how comes from France. And despite that they've been using most of that same know-how, they still can do it 3 to 5 times faster. And so regulation is part of it, but it's also a lot to do with the modular design. And when you build 7 to 8 nuclear plants every year, you actually can see this as an industry. You can build a supply chain around it. While in Europe, in France, in many countries, we still see all this as an engineering pilot or an engineering project and not as a transformation of an industry in itself. And that, of course, with the regulation that goes much faster. I've had one or other example that I had from State Grid that they said just connecting a wind farm takes about a month. In Belgium, it takes about 3 years. So getting that get approval is just You can't compare the two. But it's also about that design, but also the supply chain. And I think we're missing the fact that once the planning is there, we're going to put the wind farm there or a nuclear plant or whatever, that the whole supply chain actually starts working. And everybody starts supplying or building the products for that plan that will be executed. And that's very different in Europe, where we wait for the regulation to be done or to be approved in order to actually start building stuff. And that we waste a lot of time because of it.
We waste a lot of time, but do you think there's also something else here? Because if the West continues to head towards protectionism to try and counter this new China shock, how do you see it playing out? At what point does protecting European industry become protecting inefficiency? And actually, let me put this one to you, Martin.
Well, I think we've reached the point now where there's a much wider recognition that China is in a very innovative society. I think if we go back, to that period I was describing earlier, of the mid-late teens, then people didn't think of China in that way. And the idea that China was somehow a global leader in innovation was rather dismissed by Biden and others. Now, that is an unsustainable position because there's widespread understanding amongst at least sections of the public in Europe and less so the United States because of a different atmosphere there, that China is actually emerging as a global leader in one front after another. And therefore, I think there's a shift in attitudes towards China as a result of this. And people can see or will see that it's not good enough to sort of slam the door shut or dismiss what China's doing, but we need to know about it. We need to learn from it. And I think that's going to raise a further question, which is, well, okay, if all that's true, why is China being able to do it? And why can't we? Why is China widening the gap to us in the West? What can we do about it? And I think this is a much bigger discussion. Basically, so far, what's happened is there's a sort of, this shock 2.0 or opportunity 2.0 has rather been, dismissed as a result of subsidies or, currency manipulation or what have you. No, it's not to do with any of that. What it's to do with is that China represents a systemic challenge of our time. It is a superior force. It develops a superior economic and cultural system, and that's quite a different question. Then the learning process is a much more difficult one and challenging one, but absolutely essential.
Michal, where else is there this big gap? And of course, your area of expertise is energy. The climate dividend from this China shock really can't be underestimated, I don't think. I mean, China's clean energy exports, they're 10 times those of the United States.
I mean, the benefits from the availability of these cost-competitive, low-carbon technologies are huge. China's clean energy exports are significantly larger than the US or any other global supplier. And I think there are a number of aspects to this, right? There's the element of availability at scale. There is, China's output is really enough to meet the world's decarbonization needs for solar panels, electric vehicles through 2030 at least. There's the cost competitiveness. There's also been that adaptability with Chinese firms adapting to various needs and local market conditions. So from the decarbonization perspective, it's clearly a boon. At the same time, the scale and competitive pressure is a huge challenge in China as well, right? There's concerns about involution and the downsides that this has for Chinese firms, for the domestic market. That's one of the reasons that Chinese firms are looking to export overseas. So involution is the downside domestically of this, and that's the flip side of the opportunity. There is also the shock because we can't these debates are happening in silos with the climate community rightly saying that the low carbon technologies that are available are essential for the low carbon energy transition. But that's not the whole story. There are the industrial communities, and yes, there's the European competitiveness, but there have been subsidies in clean tech, they've been phased out. There's a lower cost of inputs, there's the scale, there's innovative capacity, there's government support, there's demand certainty. I mean, there are a lot of factors that have gone into China's advanced competitiveness. But it is now at a point where it's not just competing, but also displacing European manufacturers. And I think that's where there is a risk that if Europe loses its industrial base, and again, it's not just the China shock, it's also European elements, there will be political pushback against the energy transition. So there has to be a middle point here somewhere.
I want to talk a little bit more about where the shift in innovation is coming from, because Pascal, there was a time when companies traveled to Silicon Valley to learn, but increasingly they're traveling to Shenzhen, to Hefei or Shanghai. What do you think they're hoping to learn there that they can't learn elsewhere?
Now, that's a very interesting question, because I actually I'm bringing a lot of European execs to China to see Chinese innovation every year. I do that 7-8 times a year, and these execs have also been to Silicon Valley before. And they still go to Silicon Valley, but they go for different reasons. And I myself lived for 2 years in Silicon Valley, so I can really see how the difference is. And in my view, what you see in Silicon Valley and what has excited most Europeans is always the dream big, and then ultimately think very smart, and then scale big with risk capital. And that model has worked for decades. And in Europe, we've tried to emulate that. But the Chinese, they have big visions and big plans, but they dream very small. And what I mean by that, my experience is they're very pragmatic, very result-oriented. And then what they do different is that they iterate very, very fast and build very fast the next version. And every time they learn, and by doing that, they ultimately build systems that are as good in quality, but it's a different path. And then the fact that they work together and they collaborate in what we call ecosystems, or in partnerships with certain companies and vertical integration, that is really a model that many of the executives in Europe and even in the US are going to China to understand. Because Silicon Valley is really being the king of software. And this is easy. You can just rewrite and debug something, and you just scale again. But with hardware, it's a lot more difficult. This is hard work. And so the Chinese have been very good at scaling hardware at speed. And that's something that very few, even in Europe, can still do today. And that involves infrastructure investment, it involves talent development, it involves IP that is being created. And all that happened in the last 10, 15 years. And so China right now has a different model, a different formula, where it's more about working together in smaller groups and building results, which many execs are now interested to learn, because the world is not just about software anymore. It's more about hardware plus software.
So Martin, let's talk more about that change and about how everyone wants faster growth, faster infrastructure, faster innovation. I mean, which parts of China's experience do you think are genuinely transferable, and which only work because they are uniquely Chinese?
I think probably most of the things that we ought to learn are transferable, but they're not applicable in the same way as in China. I mean, the great difference between China and, say, the European Union is that China's much bigger in terms of population, and it's also, a single society, China, whereas the European Union remains a collection of nation states unified in very limited ways, which, as we all know, is an obstacle to speed of movement. It takes a long time to reach decisions, and some of those decisions it's very difficult to apply because of the nature of the union. So I think that, I mean, I could go on. I mean, I think that you can only really understand China in terms of its evolution over a 2,000-year period. I mean, this is something that's been hugely neglected in the West, in any, even academically, let alone in popular writing. But the fact is that China's ability to act in a relatively unified way has very deep historical roots going back to its origins as a civilization state, and the dominant kind of ideologies that grew up in China as a result of this. And I think what we're witnessing is not just what's happened this year or last year or the last decade or something else. It's got much deeper roots than that. Now, we'll never be able we can't imitate. I mean, my own country cannot become another China. It's just historically and culturally and economically and politically just so different. But we can learn a lot about, for example, thinking long term. I mean, our societies in the West have become so used to short-term thinking that we take it for granted. And our whole political system is geared to short-term thinking. It is based on short-term thinking. And this is a real problem, because this is not sort of soluble overnight or in the next year or the next 5 years or the next 10 years. But it is a problem that ultimately Europe will have to tackle, and in a very different kind of way that it has hitherto. But in the meantime, in the shorter run, yes, of course, we can learn, for example, take electric vehicles. I mean, it's clear now that the only way that the European car firms can really survive competitively with China is if they basically borrow heavily from Chinese technology, batteries, everything. There's lots of different aspects to this. The whole notion of relationship with technology and engineering, for example, is completely different in the Chinese EV context. So we can learn those kind of things. We can learn and should learn, and I think we will learn. But we'll already be in a different relationship to China than the one we're used to. It all started with the opening up. Chinese trying to attract European manufacturers like Volkswagen. Now we're in the reverse position. European manufacturers will have to learn like crazy from China and become probably ultimately part of Chinese firms.
I think it's so interesting how you talk about the ideological differences and the cultural differences. Michal, what single Chinese innovation or way of doing things has impressed you the most in recent years? I mean, because there's quite a lot to choose from, isn't there? I mean, I'm thinking of the new three: AI, robotics, innovative drugs.
And I think because of that long list, I will decline your challenge and not choose one single innovation, because they are all extremely impressive. I think it's exactly what you were saying about the way of doing things that is important and transformative. Again, you look at electric vehicles, but equally look at Weixin, like at WeChat as a platform. I know we all talk about it. It's the equivalent of WhatsApp, but it's not, right? It's this whole universe of applications and user-friendly ways of doing things. So I think it's really that what I would say is sort of the industrial clusters or these ecosystems that have emerged in China, the combination of enabling policy frameworks and fierce competition and again, these sort of industrial ecosystems and clusters are the embodiment of this. And this is something we don't talk about enough in the West. We talk about subsidies, or sometimes we talk about the technologies that are formidable, but it is that enabling environment that is both policy-led, but also bottom-up, in that it has led to such fierce competition and such dynamism. I think, to me, that's the really interesting and innovative element that China has brought, and that has enabled all this raft of technologies and innovations to come about.
And so all of those things have changed the mindset of the world towards China. I mean, in Pascal, there's been this recent study from the Pew Institute which showed that views of countries, views of China from countries from Spain to Greece to Nigeria, Colombia, Sri Lanka, are more positive than negative, and indeed more positive than they are to the United States. What do you think that tells us?
Well, the most impressive is, of course, that this all happened in 1 year time. If you would look 1 or 2 years ago, I mean, you still have a very different perception on China versus the US. So what happened in the last 1.5 years, I think we all know. It's Donald Trump who took office and who changed the world in the way that many countries and nations feel that the US is not the reliable partner it used to know, but also has a very monopolistic or threatening attitude, which is quite ironic because the US and Europe have been calling China a threat, but they've been, I mean, the US been threatening the rest of the world themselves right now. So I think for a lot of countries in the world, a lot of nations, they feel that there's a lot of words coming from the US, but actually the actions are missing. And when they see the Chinese really building stuff that they need and have a kind of a modernization model that they could copy in a way or use some parts of it to really develop further their own economies, I mean, of course, they get more attracted to China than to the US, who is now not really talking about we will lead in everything that we have, specifically when it's about AI or about space or whatever. And so I do believe that many countries are now feeling that China has at least the same to offer as the US and long term maybe more, because they will rely on these kind of production line and supply lines in the way to develop their own economy. So I think it's logical evolution. I just didn't expect it to happen in just a year time.
But Martin, the thing is that trust works both ways. I mean, if China wants more countries to learn from its experience, what does China still need to do to build that greater international confidence?
Well, just one point I wanted to make, and that is with regard to your Pew observation. And that is, if you look at the figures, what is striking is that virtually every country in the developing world gives China higher marks than the United States. I think actually China's been much more successful since about 22, 23 than it was in the period from 2016 to 2020 odd. One of the reasons was COVID. That one way or another, China, I think, took a lot of stick and a lot of harm during that period. And I think that now what China's learned is to be, to not engage in wolf warrior tactics and attacking and so on, but adopt a very actually open attitude, very reasoning attitude, not saying me. I think Xi Jinping in this period has been actually very effective compared with that previous period. So I think there's lessons in that, and I think they've drawn those lessons, and that is that China needs to be open, needs to be as open as possible, needs to be more open, and it needs to be practical, and it needs to give assistance around the world. That's the way to build relationships with countries, and to share what its vision of the future, and its vision of the future is actually being played out, enacted, established within China. So the more people can understand China, preferably at first hand, but most people will never be able to do that, of course, but that's really important.
So, Michal, when it comes down to it, if we flip it around, can your biggest strategic rival also be your best source of innovation?
Absolutely. I mean, and in some quarters in Europe today, people look at the US as strategic rival or a threat, and yet it's still a source of innovation and technology. I think the two have coexisted and continue to coexist. It's just maybe a starker picture today, but absolutely.
Michal Meidan, Pascal Coppens and Martin Jacques, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out @The Agenda Show on TikTok.
Coming up on a future agenda, digital sovereignty. Does it really matter which country controls the tech that runs our lives? But for now, from me, Juliet Mann, and all the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.